Well, hello everyone, I am back for another video. Today I'm going to be doing just a quick video on how I stretch watercolor paper over frames, and I've been doing this only for a little while, but I saw a video a long time ago that has since been taken off the internet, and that's where I got the idea from. I have a whole process behind it now, and I'm really excited to share it with you today. Today I'm just going to be doing these tiny little ones because that's easier to demonstrate on camera, but you can do this with any size. You can also make your own frames, which would cut out the first half of this video, but I'm going to show you straight from buying just a dollar store little tiny canvas from the store. So the first thing I do is obviously take everything off, and I remove all the staples from the back. And there's a couple of different ways to do this, and I will show you a few. The thing that seems to work the best is I use a pair of wire cutters. I have these jewelry cutters, and I go ahead and cut right in the middle of the staples. Once they are cut, then I use the pliers cutter to twist sideways and lift up, and then pull the pieces out. This is very time consuming, and sometimes you'll have frames that have a couple that are just stapled in too far. So for those, I do leave some of these staples in and just hammer them down. Once all the staples and the canvas is removed, and this is cheap canvas, so it literally just rips right off. Sometimes if you're having a hard time getting the staple, ripping the canvas off will allow you to have a little bit of extra room between the wood and the staple to cut the staple, so that also helps. You can remove the canvas with or without the staples on. You can just rip it right off, especially if it's cheaper kind. You could also just lie the watercolor paper over the canvas and staple it on top. However, I don't like having that extra layer between the canvas and the watercolor paper. I feel like it's going to create a wrinkle or a pocket where water can just sit and mold. Also, because these are cheap dollar store canvases, I don't know what kind of canvas this is. I don't believe that it's really good all natural canvas. I believe it could have quite a high acidity to it, which will cause the watercolor paper to discolor over time. If you really wanted to be super careful about that, you would also want to prime your frames, especially because I have no idea what wood this is. But for these pieces that I'm doing, I don't feel the need to prime the wood. I think they'll be fine, and I don't expect them to last hundreds of years. They're just little tiny pieces that I'm doing for fun. Additionally, as I mentioned before, you could just start from scratch and make your own frames. I don't have the tools to do that right now. I do hope to do it in the future. It is something that I'm working towards, but for right now, this is better for me. Once you have all the staples and the canvas off, then what you need to do is go ahead and sand down. You'll see here that this has a lot of rough edges, and so I'm just going to take some sandpaper, wherever I put it. I'm using a 320 grit, and I'm just sanding down just the very rough patches that were created by the staples being pulled out. It doesn't have to be super smooth, it's just to remove the little rough edges. I don't want them to cause bumps in the paper when I stretch the canvas, when I stretch the paper over the frame. So there we go. I have 4 frames ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and get the 5th frame ready, and then we'll go to the next step. For the watercolor, I am using a 300-pound hot press Arches watercolor paper. That's my favorite watercolor paper to use. I prefer hot press because I like using fine little detailed and small brushes, and that's just the style of watercolor that I use. You can also use a cold press paper, but make sure it is the 300-pound weight. You want something that is very strong, very heavy. For these types of frames, I'm leaving myself about an inch, a little over an inch, on all the sides, and that's how I'm going to cut the paper. I buy my paper in a huge, large watercolor pad. It's about $100 for a massive sized Arches watercolor pad, and then I cut it down into smaller pieces. This is cheaper over an extended period of time. It obviously is very expensive investment up front, but a pad of Arches paper usually lasts me about a year, year and a half. Obviously, the wider that your frame is, you want to leave yourself even more of a margin. You're going to want to measure that out so that when it wraps around, it comes right to the edge or just barely to the edge, depending on the look you're going for. I like to have just a little bit of wood showing, but I do have a couple pieces where I cut it a little too long, and so it does hang over the edge. After you've cut the paper down into the size that you want, I do recommend putting some kind of mark on the back so you can keep track of what is the top of the paper and what is the bottom of the paper. For those of you that aren't aware or haven't used higher quality art paper before, it does matter what side of the paper you use. It all has to do with how the paper is made, and the top piece of the paper is actually the most important side, so you do want to mark what is the back so that you don't lose track of it. I usually just put a small penciled B, which when I'm wrapping usually gets tucked in and stapled so you don't even see it after the fact. So I'm going to show you the entire process sped up here before we get started so you can see what we're doing. What you need to start with is a bin of water. I usually use this metal pan because it fits most of the sizes I'm doing. If you're doing a bigger sized watercolor paper, you can use a plastic bin. I've also seen people use their bathtubs, and people who have really large kitchen sinks can do it right in their kitchen sink. But I use this pan because it's easy and it's flat and I can let it sit. It does need to sit for a few minutes, and this will depend on the type of paper you're using. Obviously, a thinner paper will take less time, and a heavier paper will take more time. For the Arches hot press, it takes about a minute or two for the paper to really saturate, and I test it by kind of like rolling the edges, and if it rolls really easily in my fingers, then I know that it's wet enough to work. You don't want it wet enough that it's going to disintegrate the paper, but you want it wet enough that it will be able to fold really easily, and also that you can pull it tight. If it gets too wet, you will not be able to pull it tight. The staples will actually rip the paper, and yeah, I've done that a few times. So definitely try to test out the paper in strips before you waste expensive paper by doing an entire canvas. So what I did was I took some of the odds and ends strips that I keep around for like notes and testing colors, and I just tested those to find the right length of time for this particular type of paper that I'm using. Once the paper has soaked, you'll want to have a towel handy, and you want to get all of the excess water off of the top and the bottom of the paper. Usually a few dabs with a nice towel and it works fine. You can also use paper towels, but I'm trying to be more eco-friendly, so towel works great. The only problem with the towel is sometimes you do get little fuzzies, but once the paper dries, you can just brush them off. I haven't had any problems yet as long as you use a nice clean towel. Just be careful, you don't want to stain the paper if you have something else on the towel, so don't use your art towels for this. Once the excess water has dried off, then you can very easily fold it over the wooden part of the frame. And I usually staple it in across from each other first. So I start with one side, use a couple staples, and then pull it nice and tight and staple the opposites, the parallel side. The tricky part is actually when it comes to doing the tops and the bottoms, because you have to very evenly tuck in the paper. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. You can either cut slits in the paper on the corners and fold those over nice and neat, Or what I do is I press in the extra paper on the corners and then fold it down 2 folds. The first is the interior piece of the paper of the fold, and then the second is the top piece. And you'll see that here. Make sure you staple in the corners really well because that is what's going to hold the piece together. And you're all set. They do take about anywhere from 24 to 48 hours depending on how big the piece is and how long you let it soak. These small pieces that I do usually take about 24 hours to dry. They will feel, when they're still wet, you will still be able to bend the paper slightly. I recommend not doing that because you can put divots in the paper. Just let it sit and it will tighten back up. The one thing I have noticed is that once it has been stretched, it usually holds up pretty well unless you're doing a very, very, very heavy wash. So what I would actually recommend is if you're going to do a base wash on your watercolors, to do it while the paper is still wet, so then when it tightens, it actually won't wrinkle. But if you wet it after it's already tightened onto the frame, you can cause ripples and divots. I've never had it happen to me, but I've seen it happen to other people, and so that is something to watch out for. I'm going to just speed through and show you the process a couple more times in case there's anything else you can see from seeing it being done multiple times. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment box below, and I hope you found this video helpful. Alright, so now I have all 5 finished canvases. You'll see some variation in color. That will hopefully go away. I've found that depending on the type of paper you use, sometimes you can expose flaws in the paper. Let's see if you can see that or not. But there's little spots on this. I believe once it dries, that's going to go away because it's not on any of these, so it's got to be that type of paper that I used. The nicer the paper, the less flaws there are, but of course there's always going to be flaws in the way the paper was made that are going to be more apparent when the paper is soaked. Shouldn't affect the color, shouldn't affect anything. These are going to be soft for at least 24 hours. I usually wait 48 hours before I try to use these. As they dry, they will tighten, and then there will be more resistance. It won't be so soft, and you won't. Right now, I could very easily poke a hole through the paper, but once it dries, that will not be the case. So give it plenty of time to dry, especially if you've soaked it for a really long time. And then you have your wrapped watercolor paper on frames. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a like and consider subscribing. I make new art videos every single Wednesday at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, remember to create love and travel on. Bye!